Hi, I'm Deborah Newton, and today we'll look at a few problems involving domain and range and also interval notation. Okay, so we're doing domain and range. So really quickly, let's talk about domain and range. Domain is always the x values. Range is always the y values. Okay, we're going to write our answer for domain and range in something called interval notation. You will use this a lot in your math classes. So just some quick pointers on interval notation for domain and range. First of all, for the domain, I'm just going to abbreviate that D. You're going to go from left to right, because remember that domain is the x value, so you're really only talking about the horizontal axis. For range, I'm going to abbreviate that R. You're going to go from bottom to top. Okay, one more thing to remember with interval notation is we use two different symbols. We use parentheses or brackets. We're going to use parentheses, either an open or a close, when you are not including the endpoint or with infinity. Okay, remember the symbol for infinity is just a sideways 8 looking thing. You're going to use brackets, so either an open or a close, when you are including the endpoints. Okay, so we're going to take these concepts and we're going to look at a few examples. So let's look at the first one. Notice the graph just looks like a line. So the first thing we're going to do is find the domain. So the domain, remember, we're looking only from left to right. Now these arrows indicate that this graph goes on forever to the left and forever to the right. So the graph would eventually go all the way back to negative infinity, because it goes back forever and ever. If we're looking at how far to the right or how far forward it goes, it also goes on forever and ever. So the domain is actually not that interesting. It's negative infinity to infinity. In other words, any value. Okay. Now let's transition to the range. So when you look at the range, you're no longer looking from left to right, you're looking from bottom to top. And so what you have to ask yourself is, how far to the bottom will my graph eventually reach? And the answer to that is it goes on forever. So again, it goes down to negative infinity. And then you put a comma, and then your next question is, how far to the top will my graph eventually go? And the answer to that is infinity. So in this case, we have the same domain and range. That won't always happen, but both domain and range go from negative infinity to infinity. Okay, so we're defining the domain and range again. So let's start with the domain. Again, I'm going to use the letter D. So what you're really asking yourself is, how far back to the left and then how far to the right does your graph go? These arrows again indicate that the graph goes on forever. So if you were to continue this graph forever, it would go all the way back. In other words, back to negative infinity. If you continue drawing this graph to the right, it will go all the way to positive infinity. So the domain is again negative infinity to positive infinity. Okay, let's switch gears and look at the range. So when you look at the range, you're only looking at the graph from bottom to top. Okay, so this is a little different. So we're looking at, where is the bottommost point of the graph? Well, the graph doesn't even begin until the number 3. So the bottom of the graph is at 3. Now the question is, do we use a parentheses or do we use a bracket? Well, we use a bracket because it actually begins at 3. We include 3. Okay, and then there's a comma, and then the next question is, how far up will the graph go? And the answer to that is, it will go up forever or to infinity. All right, so we're going to be finding the domain and range of this sort of circle anyway. So the domain is going to be left to right. So there is a clear starting point on the left and a clear ending point on the right. So the graph starts on the right. It begins at the x value of negative 2. We do use a bracket because we are including -2, and it stops at a right ending point of +2. So the domain is -2, 2, 2. The range, we are no longer looking horizontally. For the range, we look vertically. So we look from bottom to top, and the bottom point that the graph begins at is -2. The top ending point is 2. Again, it's just a coincidence that the domain and range ended up being the same here. That definitely won't always happen. All right, so for this graph, there are 2 pieces to the graph, and we do need to make sure we're looking at both of them. So let's start with the domain. Domain is left to right. It really doesn't matter which piece I'm looking at. If I continue drawing either piece, I'm going to go all the way back to -infinity and all the way forward on the right-hand side to infinity. So the domain is -infinity to infinity as it has been in the past. The range is more interesting to look at. So I do have 2 pieces that I need to consider. So I usually just split them up into 2 pieces. We're looking from bottom to top. So first we're going to look at the bottom piece, ignoring the top piece for now. Okay, so for the bottom piece, it will go all the way to -infinity if you're going from bottom to top, but then it has a clear stopping point at -3. We do use a bracket there. Okay, and now let's move on to the top portion. Okay, you do these separately and you combine them with a symbol known as U that stands for union. So we're unioning this interval with the next one that we're about to look at. So now let's focus on the top piece. If you're going from bottom to top, there's a clear starting value on the bottom, and that is +2. But then the arrows indicate that we will go all the way up to infinity. So the range has 2 sections for it, just like the graph has 2 sections. All right, this graph is a little unusual. Notice that open circle at the bottom of that shape. That is intended to mean that the graph does not cross through that point. So we're going to keep that in mind when we do the domain and the range here. So the domain is going to be in 2 pieces. You have the left section to the left of that open circle, and you have the right section to the right of that open circle. So we always go from left to right. So let's focus on the left-hand side for now. That arrow will take it all the way back to -infinity. But there is a stopping point or kind of a skipping point. So we stop at the number 2. Okay, and this is a little different, but we do not want to include that 2. That's what the open circle means. So rather than a bracket, we're going to use a parentheses. And then we begin with the right-hand piece of that shape. So we're going to, again, use the union symbol. So now let's ignore the left-hand side and just look at the right-hand side. We do begin at 2, but we do not include 2. So that's why we use the parentheses there. And then we will go all the way to the right from -infinity. Okay, so if you think about it, the domain is really every single number except for 2. We don't include 2 on the left-hand portion, and we don't include 2 on the right-hand portion, but every other number is kind of covered. Now let's move on to the range. For range, again, we look from bottom to top. So we do start the graph at 0, but notice that open circle again indicates that we're not actually going to include 0. So we begin at 0, but we will use a parentheses, and we eventually go up to infinity. All right, so our final example differs from the previous ones in that it does not have a graph. So when you're given an equation, one way to do it is to get a graph. You can do this through the use of a graphing utility. So if you have a graphing calculator, you just punch your Y button, enter in your equation. The graph does look like this. So we'll draw our axis. It is basically a parabola shifted up 4 units. So if you want to sketch your own graph, you can. Okay, so once you have a graph, then it's just like the ones that we have done previous. So the domain will be left to right. Okay, so we will go all the way back to -infinity. We will go all the way forward to +infinity. The range, we go bottom to top. We don't begin this graph until the number 4. Unlike the one we just did, it's a closed circle, so we do include 4. And we eventually go up to +infinity.